Kuzon is not Azulon. Aang's old friend Kuzon is not the same person as Fire Lord Azulon. There's a theory out there that Kuzon is Azulon, but there is no evidence for this theory. There is a lot of evidence against the theory, though. So, during Fire Lord Azulon's funeral, the Fire Sages accidentally say that Azulon was Fire Lord for 23 years, but this is a continuity error, and so the creators later fixed it and they said Azulon was Fire Lord for 75 years. So Azulon was Fire Lord for 75 years of the war, and during the last 5 years of the war, Ozai was the Fire Lord, and during the first 20 years of the war, Sozin was still the Fire Lord. So 20, 75, 5, that makes 100. Now Aang was frozen in ice for 100 years. And it also says that Azulon was born during the same year as the Air Nomad genocide. So before Aang was frozen in ice for 100 years, he was friends with Kuzon. But Azulon was born the same year as the Air Nomad genocide. Presumably, Azulon was born after Aang disappeared. So how would Aang be friends with someone who is not even born yet? Kuzon is much older than Azulon, and Azulon wasn't even born when Kuzon and Aang were hanging out, so Kuzon is not Azulon. Also, as I mentioned before with Bumi, and how I think that King Bumi was never a prince, air nomads are very frugal and simple people, and they wouldn't be hanging out with a bunch of rich people, and they wouldn't be friends with really privileged people. They would try to be friends with more common folk, more regular people. And so it would make no sense for Aang to be hanging out with the prince of the Fire Nation. It would make no sense for Aang to be hanging out with the crown prince of the Fire Nation. Like, that just would not happen. And if Aang was hanging out with the prince of the Fire Nation, then Sozin, Fire Lord Sozin, would know about it, and Fire Lord Sozin would be suspicious of Aang because Aang would be like a 12-year-old or less than 12-year-old airbender at this point, and Sozin already knows that the next avatar is an airbender, and based on Aang's age, Sozin would have put together that Aang was born right when Roku died, so Sozin would have tried to kill Aang or capture him sooner. So there's no way Aang would have been able to hang out with Azulon without Sozin knowing. And Aang as an air nomad would have never been hanging out with such a rich person anyway. Now, the only things we know about Kuzon are, of course, that Kuzon and Aang were good friends when Aang was still a normal kid. And Aang says that he and Kuzon got into a lot of trouble together. And there is also a story about how Aang and Kuzon helped return a dragon egg. And Aang, of course, mentions Kuzon to Zuko. And Aang mentions that Aang wonders if Zuko had lived during the same time as Kuzon, then maybe Aang could have been friends with Zuko too. And Aang uses Kuzon's name when he infiltrates a Fire Nation school. He pretends his name is Kuzon. And also, Aang visits the town where Kuzon used to presumably live. So when Aang and his friends, Katara, Toph, and Sokka, get their Fire Nation outfits, they're visiting a town in the eastern part of the Fire Nation, and Aang mentions that he used to come to that town to visit his friend Kuzon all the time. So the Fire Nation capital is in the western part of the Fire Nation. So why on earth would the Prince of the Fire Nation be all the way in the eastern part when his home, the capital, is in the western part? It would make no sense. So that's just another piece of evidence to show that Kuzon is not Azulon. So there is no merit to this theory of Kuzon being Azulon. It is completely unrealistic, and Kuzon was just Aang's friend. And I would assume by the time Aang comes out of the iceberg, Kuzon is probably dead, but who knows?